Welcome, Gunrunner.
The original MSX machines arrived in 1983 as the first attempt to create a common home computer standard, and soon dominated the Japanese market before experiencing a great deal of success in parts of Europe too, particularly the Netherlands and Spain, as well as Brazil, Korea, and even more surprisingly, North Africa. A joint project between Microsoft Japan, Spectra Video, and the ASCII Corporation, the hardware was rather unique for the time in that it was licensed out to different manufacturers around the world to make their own machines with their own unique designs. But by the time the MSX hit the market, the designers and engineers behind the standard had already started working on a follow-up. By the time the MSX2 arrived on the scene 2 years later in 1985, the hardware was now in full control of the ASCII Corporation, but the same licensing system remained. Spectra Video had dropped out during development of the original MSX, and Microsoft had now taken a back step to focus on the emergence of the IBM PC compatible and their own MS-DOS operating system. However, Microsoft still did provide support for its basic programming language. Although the MSX2 and the even further enhanced MSX2 Plus were essentially just upgrades of the same 8-bit hardware that retained full backwards compatibility with the MSX1, the new graphics and sound chips on offer meant that many games rivaled the ones found on 16-bit computers of the time. Whilst the MSX2 wasn't quite as popular as its predecessor, especially outside of Japan, it still built up a pretty amazing catalogue of games that included some hugely influential titles, several of which you will see on this list. It's also worth noting at this point that I've already done a video looking at MSX1 Exclusives, so if you want to see some of those too, then follow the link in the description. And if you want to know more about either the MSX1 or MSX2, then you can also watch my amazing facts episodes for each one. Again, these are linked down below. But with all the important info over, it's now time to get on with the show as I proudly present 10 amazing MSX2 exclusives.
Panasonic がすごい遊びを連れてやってきた。ゲームがすごい、パソコン通信がすごい。パーソナルコンピューター A1 登場。Panasonic.
I don't think I need to tell you that Vampire Killer is the original name for the legendary Konami franchise Castlevania. What you might not know is that for this MSX2 release, the name was never actually changed when it was released in Europe. This is because Vampire Killer on the MSX was actually developed alongside the Nintendo Famicom version and released in the West first, before the Castlevania name had been decided on for the NES release. While Vampire Killer shares the same premise, soundtrack, characters and locations, the structure of the game and its play mechanics differ significantly from its NES counterpart. Like Castlevania, it also consists of 18 stages with a boss encounter at the end of every third stage. But in contrast to the linear level designs of the NES game, Vampire Killer features more labyrinth-like stages, requiring the player to not only seek out the exit to the next stage, but also the skeleton key required to unlock it. The MSX game is also flip screen rather than scrolling, and allows you to purchase new weapons from traders to replace your trusty whip. There are also lots of other more minor differences too, but it would simply take too long to list them all here. Vampire Killer unsurprisingly impresses both sonically and visually, and really pushes the hardware on both fronts. Definitely the best arcade adventure available for the MSX2 range. Known to many under the more simple title of Corvallis II, this is an updated version of Compile's highly acclaimed MSX game Devil Corvallis. This action-oriented RPG has often been compared to the Nintendo NES game Zelda 2. It features a very generic RPG style plot, telling you something about demons taking over the land and you being the only one who can save it, of course. The main core of the game is the overworld map, which you can pretty much move around at will. This adds a rather strange perspective though, as although it's essentially top down as you no doubt expect, sprites are viewed side on. However, when you enter specific locations, it switches over to a full on side scrolling platformer. Our hero is armed with a sword to fight off the many enemies, and must collect gold in order to purchase various items he needs on his quest. As usual, there are also lots of strange looking folk you need to speak to, who give you helpful hints and clues amongst the usual rather useless waffle. New Devil Corvallis is an absolutely huge game that will probably take you several hours to complete, so there's a good job they added a password feature so you can carry on where you left off with all your items intact. The graphics and sound are both of a pretty high quality, and the familiar gameplay will certainly please any RPG fans reading this. Also known under its Japanese title of Hinotori, this game was only ever released in Japan, but more recently it was fully translated into English to make it more accessible to us Westerners, and thankfully so, because it's a brilliant title for the MSX2 that very much seems to be a spin-off of another amazing MSX game from Konami in Nightmare. The similarities are easy to see, as it's also a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up where you control a lone warrior taking out hordes of mystical monsters and undead enemies. Like Nightmare, you can also collect various power-ups and bonus items to aid you on your journey, but there is the need to collect very specific items in order to progress here. And this is where the English translation becomes very important, because boxes pop up on the screen with instructions as well as helpful hints and tips. The game is a lot less linear than Nightmare 2, as you have to avoid traps, jump over hazards and negotiate corridors. There is also a limited inventory system for selecting weapons, which plays an important part of the game, as specific skills are better for different areas. The visuals are also pretty good, if nothing amazing, but the soundtrack in true Konami style is outstanding. Firebird the Phoenix Saga is a real hidden gem for the MSX2 that deserves a lot more attention. Hopefully this review will bring it some. It's pretty well known that the Metal Gear franchise debuted on the MSX way back in 1987, with the Nintendo version arriving a few months later. But it's not so well known that the MSX also got an exclusive sequel a few years later in the form of Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, which was developed at the same time as the NES sequel Snake's Revenge. Hideo Kojima was at the helm once again to design and produce this title, and it follows many of the same themes as its predecessor, once again taking the form of a top-down stealth-orientated arcade adventure. In fact, Solid Snake builds greatly upon the stealth-based gameplay system of its predecessor. You're still tasked with infiltrating an enemy stronghold whilst avoiding detection from soldiers and surveillance devices, but this is now made a lot harder due to the changes in enemy AI. Soldiers can now patrol the whole base rather than single screens, have a much wider field of vision and can also detect sounds. Once you're discovered by the enemy, a counter on the upper right hand side of the screen starts to decrease, and if it hits 0, the alarms are activated. The only way to reset it is to hide so you can't be detected. You also have more abilities now too, which will all be needed to evade the enemy. Both the graphics and sound are excellent here, and although the game is pretty tough, the learning curve is set just right. The second game in the popular Laydock series, this is the only one that wasn't multi-format and remains an MSX2 exclusive. What is also very interesting about this entry is that unlike Laydock 1 and Super Laydock, Last Attack isn't purely a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up, it actually has stages that scroll horizontally too. However, despite these regular perspective changes, the gameplay remains very much the same, with the key docking feature remaining. This clever mechanic, which the name of the franchise obviously hints at, is only activated when you play the game in 2-player mode. Add a friend and you're able to dock your ships together to create a much more powerful fighter, with player 1 controlling all the movement and player 2 taking charge of the weapons. As well as your standard weapon, which can of course be upgraded by collecting power-ups, you also have a shield that depletes whenever you're hit, rather than just a one hit and you're dead characteristic of many other shoot 'em ups of this era. Apart from all this, it's pretty standard stuff, with your usual array of futuristic enemies that includes some screen-sized bosses. The visuals are a very high standard here, and I know that MSX2 owners will be particularly pleased to see the smooth scrolling. There's also some decent enough music and sound effects too. Laydock 2 is a shooter of the very highest quality. Often overshadowed by another similar Konami game in Vampire Killer, the Treasure Review SAS is also a platform-style arcade adventure aimed at the enhanced MSX2 machines. The plot of the game tells us that many centuries ago, Indurus, the god of war, banished the supreme mother god Usas from the kingdom and threw the 4 pieces of her magical jewel into the winds. 2 heroes, known simply as Wit and Kless, are set out on a mission to find the broken jewel and achieve one of the greatest discoveries of the academic world. Obviously, this is where you come in, as you must guide these brave fellows through the 5 different stages, hunting down the 4 pieces of the jewel before a final confrontation with Indurus himself. You have a projectile weapon to defeat the bad guys, and your character can display one of 4 different emotions. Now this is important because not only does it change your method of attack, it also has to match that of each and every end of level boss in order to defeat them. Each character has their own strengths and you can switch between them at set points within the game. They also have their own individual health bars too, so this is often an important consideration. USAS is a fairly attractive game and also has a nice soundtrack too, so if you own an MSX2 and like these types of platform style adventures, then this should be considered an essential purchase. name obviously suggests, this is the sequel to the first Celeste game, which is also known on the Sega Master System under the title Power Strike. But what's interesting about this is that there are actually two alternative sequels to the game on the MSX2, this one and Celeste Gaiden, which takes place in an alternative timeline. Both games are excellent, but if I had to choose my favourite one of the two, it would be this, so here we are. Celeste 2 is also notable for being the first game in the franchise to feature the recurring heroine Eleanor, and takes place in the year 2039, 2 decades after the supercomputer DIA-51 attacked and decimated the planet. But just as things have started to return to normal, Earth is invaded by a race of alien plant-like humanoids called the Vagand, who are intent on finding a new food source in our homeworld. In their first attack, these invaders managed to destroy a starship piloted by the protagonist of the previous game, Ray Wiseman. Desperate to get revenge on Earth's unwelcome guests, his daughter, who is of course the aforementioned Eleanor, jumps into a ship of her own and heads out to face the Vagand and their evil leader Geisel. Interesting plot aside, Compile Celeste 2 is your regular vertically scrolling space shooter, but one of the very highest quality, with great power-ups, nice graphics and a really excellent soundtrack. Now, if you've already watched my video looking at MSX1 exclusives, then you'll have heard me talk about the superb top-down racing game F1 Spirit, which remains one of my favourite titles for the computer. And until I came to research in this video, I wasn't aware that there was actually a sequel for the MSX2 Plus, but the moment I saw it I knew I had to play it. Now there is one very big change in this follow-up, that anyone who is familiar with the first game will have spotted immediately. The top-down perspective is gone, in favour of a more traditional third person behind the car view, somewhat like the classic Namco arcade game Pole Position. There are also some changes to the way the game is set up too, as in addition to the regular free run and Grand Prix modes, there is a new 2-player battle mode. Other in-game options include difficulty level, number of laps and the ability to customise your car. Perhaps the most interesting feature of all though is the ability to link up to 2 MSX2 computers via the second joystick ports for that aforementioned battle mode. Picking up on another point I just mentioned, this is the only game Konami released that makes use of the more advanced MSX2 Plus specification, and, even more importantly, its greatly enhanced audio capabilities. So we have amazing sound combined with awesome visuals to create an all-round incredible racing experience. Also known under the original Japanese title of Yurei-kun, but since translated into English by the MSX community, Mr. Ghost is the true definition of a hidden gem, and on a list that's dominated by arcade-style shooters, it really stands out of the crowd. You see, although Mr. Ghost is probably best described as a vertically scrolling shoot-em-up, or cute-em-up in this case, it's quite unlike any other games that I've played. So we have the titular character who can move around the screen shooting enemies and picking up the coins the enemies leave behind, but from here things get very different. Mr. Ghost is also armed with a second attack, the Bottom Bash, that can be used to both kill enemies up close and also destroy blocks on the screen. Some of these blocks contain power-ups, but you can only collect these if you have enough money to exchange for them. Your attacks are also limited, and every time you use one the power-up bar depletes. so you have to choose wisely, especially as only some blocks have power-ups inside them. This does replenish eventually, but very slowly, though some power-ups do help with this, as well as upgrading your attacks. Graphically, the game is gorgeous with its cute characters and bold colours, however I should point out the flick screen scrolling. The soundtrack is even better still, one of the best on the MSX2 in fact. Mr. Ghost is a veritable bundle of pure joy. Yet another amazing Konami exclusive, Space Mambo has become a bit of a cult classic in the MSX world over the years, and is often brought up when people talk about the best games for the second ROM of the computer. Now you might be wondering where the rather strange name of this horizontally scrolling shooter comes from, and indeed I was quite intrigued myself, so I ended up googling it. Apparently it refers to your ship in the game, which is shaped like a giant Mambo fish. And speaking of that ship, it has a rather unique power-up system that is modelled somewhat on the options found in the Gradius series, but with its own unique quirks, which I'll explain a bit more. So there are only 2 weapon types available here, but each of these can be powered up and assisted by those aforementioned options that can be shifted around your ship to cover all angles. However, if you don't continually collect power-ups, the effectiveness of your weapon decreases. The power bar in the info panel at the top of the screen helps manage this. Visually, Space Mambo is stunning, right from the very start, and that superb intro to the beautifully designed bosses. Being a Konami game, you also no doubt predicted it would have an amazing soundtrack too, and you'd be right in that assumption. For me, Space Mambo is the best game of its type on the MSX2, and a real must-have title.
Para algunos, un ordenador familiar es así, o así, o así. Para Sony, un ordenador familiar es así, sencillo, práctico y útil, para ordenar, estudiar, trabajar, jugar y para aprender juntos toda la familia. Los ordenadores Hitbit son compatibles MSX y pueden crecer. Es un Sony.
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing MSX2 exclusives. Can you think of any other one-off titles that only ever came out for this hugely powerful 8-bit computer? Or do you think some of these games were unworthy of inclusion? I also love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comment section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons who continue to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons and YouTube backers in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Grady Haynes, Mitchell Valentino, Seth A. Robinson, Carl Olsen, Dos Gamerman, Sonic Mania 999, Paul Andrew, Andrew McKay, Retro Resolution, Matt Standish, James Taylor, Trogdall the Burninator, Mins, 8-Bit Guy, Luke MC, Tabby Kitsune, and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now. You can get access to extra content, including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.